Like a backstage pass to the world of fly fishing travel, this is Waypoints, the podcast of destination angling. News and events, helpful travel tips, destination profiles, great stories, and expert advice from some of the most seasoned and experienced names in fishing travel. Waypoints is brought to you by Yellow Dog Fly Fishing Adventures, the industry's #1 specialty travel company for the very best insider knowledge, logistical support, and trip preparation. Freshwater or saltwater, international or domestic, Yellow Dog has you covered for your next fishing adventure. And now, your Waypoints host, Yellow Dog founder and director, Jim Klug.
RIO Products is a brand renowned for its fly lines, leaders, and tippet. Founded in Idaho in 1990, RIO has become an industry standard, designing terminal tackle tailored to the needs of anglers and driven by an ethos of innovation and performance. Chris Walker is RIO's lead product designer and R&D manager, in charge of the development and innovation of products known for their strength, durability, and casting performance. Chris's work at RIO has helped to shape the company's entire lineup, and his contributions have influenced the development and evolution of some of the most popular lines, leaders, and tippet in all of fly fishing. His attention to detail and his passion for fishing, particularly on his home waters of Idaho, have helped solidify RIO as the go-to brand when it comes to performance and versatility for tackle that directly connects anglers to fish. Chris is joining us today to specifically talk leaders and tippet, arguably the most important foundational components of any fly fishing setup. But as standard and as important as leaders and tippet are for every fishing scenario, there is a lot of confusion amongst anglers when it comes to material options, performance metrics, strength to diameter ratios, knot strength, and more. So as we've done in the past with fly lines and other key pieces of equipment, we're dedicating this episode to issues and facts about leader and tippet, answering some of the common questions and discussing material choices, ratings, and how to properly match tippet and leaders with different fishing scenarios. Chris Walker, welcome to Waypoints, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Jim. It's great to be here.
Well, this is, we get questions all the time about leader and tippet, and I think every angler, they want to pretend they know all about it, and they don't want to come across as foolish or, misinformed, so they don't ask a lot of questions about it. But I thought it would be great if we kind of specifically talked about the basic knowledge of leader and tippet and how that applies to all of our fishing scenarios as anglers, right?
Absolutely. It's a really important part of the terminal tackle. It's the last connection to the fish. And if you don't have that right, nothing else is going to work behind it. So,
and nothing else matters at that point.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Well, before we get into the nitty gritty, tell us a little bit about your background, Chris, and how you found your way to the fly fishing industry and specifically to the crazy world of fly lines, leader, and tippet.
Yeah, sure. Really, I was in the right place at the right time. I'd always been an angler. I grew up fishing with my dad, picked up fly fishing when I was about 12 years old. I went to engineering school, got a degree in material science and engineering, and from there I worked in the aerospace industry for a year and then moved on to semiconductor manufacturing actually for 4 years. Decided that wasn't really my speed. I wanted to do something a little closer to fishing and really just found a great job posting with RIO. I had a little bit of a connection through a brand ambassador and basically applied, went out, interviewed, and the rest is history. I've been there about 7 years now.
I love it. You're like, there's not much money in semiconductors. I'm going to go get rich in fly fishing.
You got it. Exactly. Perfect. It was a great financial decision.
Financial decision. It always is in this industry.
Oh, yeah.
For sure. Well, Chris, we know that when it comes to fly lines, leader, tippet, and terminal tackle, it's super easy to geek out on these details. I mean, we could go down all kinds of rabbit holes, and we could easily talk for hours about any one of these specific components or categories. But today we want to focus solely on leader and tippet, as these are elements that every single angler, of course, uses. But, at the same time, as we mentioned, people don't always know a lot about the intricacies of leader and tippet, right? I know that even if anglers don't want to admit it, there is a lot of confusion out there when it comes to the different options, the different materials, and how to specifically apply these different products to different scenarios and applications. So let's start with some basic questions to make sure that everyone listening understands what we're talking about and is on the same page. We'll start at the very basics. First off, the difference between leader and tippet. What are we talking about here?
Sure. So the difference between a leader and a tippet is the leader is actually a continuation of the taper of your fly line. So when I think of a leader, that includes everything from the very end of your fly line down to your fly. Within that leader, you have a section that we refer to as the tippet. That's the last section before you tie your fly on. It's the closest to the terminal end of your whole system, and it's typically level in diameter. So on a basic level in fly fishing, when we say leader, we mean a tapered leader from a thick end down to a thin end. Within that leader, you have a thin section that's usually a level diameter, so it doesn't vary, and that's your tippet.
So if you start with a store-bought packaged taper leader right off the wall in the fly shop, the tippet is already integrated into that leader, right? It's the thinnest part at the very end and the part of the leader that connects directly to the fly.
Yep.
So technically, you can fish with only packaged leaders. If you want to be that person that buys a giant stack of them and you fish with that, it's going to work. You're ready to go right out of the package. But then you start changing flies, right? You start swapping out patterns, you're retying, you're losing flies. That packaged leader starts to get shorter. And at which point, you can either take off that entire leader and replace the entire thing, but it's kind of a waste because you have a lot of great material left, or you can simply rebuild that leader by adding tippet back to the thin end, right? This tippet is a set diameter. As you mentioned, it's a kind of a level tippet, and that keeps that leader in play.
Yep, that's exactly right. So I think of tippet as a leader saver as much as anything else in terms of what the product does for you. So instead of buying a brand new fully tapered leader every time your tippet gets short, you can buy a small spool of tippet and add on as you go. That keeps your leader in play longer, keeps you fishing longer, and you can also tune your leader and how it casts according to scenarios by changing the length of that tippet as well.
Well, these days, a knotless tapered leader is the most popular type of leader sold, right? Basically, it's an extruded kind of technology or process where it starts fat at the butt end that ties to the line, and then it tapers gradually knotless down to the thin end. You walk into a fly shop, you see an entire wall that is filled with packaged tapered leaders, tippet spools. You buy the length and the diameter listed on the package, and you have a tapered setup that's ready to go, right? You simply attach that fat butt end of the extruded tapered leader to the loop of the fly line, and then you tie your fly on the other end, and it's simple. You're good to go. But with all of the options, and again, picture that wall in the fly shop, right? It's just there's hundreds of different packages up there of leaders and tippet spools, a lot of options hanging on that wall. I know this confuses a lot of people. So when you buy a packaged leader or a spool of tippet, let's start off with what we call the X factor, right? This is a rating that is used to describe the diameter or thickness of the tippet material and the part of the leader that will be closest to the fly. That's the X. So basically, it's a traditional system in fly fishing that helps anglers choose the appropriate size and diameter for specific fishing conditions and strength. Talk to us a little bit about the X system.
Sure. So on the most basic level, the X system tells you the diameter of the tippet you're buying. Obviously, you're going to choose different diameters for different fishing applications. And the thing that trips a lot of people up is the X system, as it goes up in number. If I go from 5X to 6X to 7X, my tippet is actually getting smaller. So a lot of people, that's a misconception. They think bigger number means bigger break strength, bigger diameter. It's just the opposite.
The higher the number, the thinner and lighter the tippet.
Exactly right. Yep. So that's the most simplistic way to describe that system. The true detailed explanation of the X system is the diameter of your tippet is equal to 11 thousandths of an inch minus the X size. So to give you an example, a 4X leader, if I take 11 thousandths of an inch, I subtract 4X, I get 7 thousandths of an inch. That should be the diameter of the tippet on that leader or that spool of tippet if you are buying just a spool of tippet.
I hope everybody wrote that formula down at home. That's an important one. But basically, the higher the number, the thinner and the lighter the tippet. For example, a 0X tippet is obviously thicker and stronger than 6X, which, as you said, doesn't really register. You think the bigger the number, the thicker it's going to be, or the heavier or stronger it's going to be, but that's not the case with the X. It's the pound test rating that basically indicates the amount of pressure the tippet can withstand before breaking.
Yep.
So the X system essentially starts at 0X. it goes, I mean, gosh, I've been in Japan and seen like 10x, like ultra thin.
Yeah.
But on the other end of that 0x, and let's say 0x falls somewhere between like 12 and 15 pounds, right, on breakage strength. Then you go the other way, and this is what gets really confusing for a lot of people. Now we totally discard the X rating system and we go back to pounds. So you go from 2X down to 1X down to 0X, but then hanging right next to it on the wall, now you've got 10 pound, 12 pound, 16 pound, 20 pound. So it's this hybrid of these two different rating systems, which I think can confuse a lot of anglers.
Yeah, absolutely. So like we said, with the formula of the X system, 11 thousandths minus the X size gives you your diameter. I've actually seen Tippet marketed as -1X or -2X, and now your formula gets even more complicated. It's 11 thousandths minus -2. That's 13 thousandths. So at that point, it's just easier to deal with pound test. We write the diameter at RIO of every tippet. So you'll see, 013 if it's a 13 thousandths diameter tippet, and then a pound break strength rating as well.
So most package leaders and tippet spools will have that fine print on there. Aside from just saying, for instance, 3X, it'll also give you the specs on the diameter and whatnot.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Now, one thing we've seen in the industry over the last few years is several companies have come out with, they've got their 4X, they've got 5X, but now they have 4.5X or 5.5, like these half steps. Is that legitimate, or is it kind of a gimmick, or what are the thoughts on that?
I would say it is legitimate. They're actually made to a different diameter spec. So a 4.5X tippet is actually going to be, a half X size thinner than a 4X tippet. They're manufactured to different specs. They have a slightly different break strength. But what I would tell you is, if you're starting out and you're confused by half sizes, you can have 4X and you can have 5X. You don't need 4.5. They're so similar. The differences are really marginal there. People who want to get really technical and really specific about what tippet they use find some value in those half sizes, but it's not necessary to have a good day of fishing, certainly.
Now, a lot of times people walk in and they're thinking, okay, what size do I need, right? I mean, they want to cover the bases. They want to have the right leader, the right tippet for the application that, the opportunity that they're going to go out and pursue. Is there an easy way to decide which tippet size we're going to use for different fish species, or do you just kind of have to think about it as like a common sense approach where you're not going to fish a super light tippet to big, powerful creatures and vice versa? I know that people come in all the time and say, well, what do I need for this particular situation? Is there an easy way to kind of think about this?
Sure. Yeah, there's, there are rules of thumb with different fish species, certainly. I prefer to think of it in terms of fly, particularly in trout fishing. Trout fishing is a really broad application. There's a million different fly patterns, everything from big, to triple articulated streamers down to size 24 Griffiths gnats. You can't get the same tippet through the eyelet of the hook with that wider range of flies and applications. So really in trout fishing, I'm trying to match my tippet to the size fly I'm fishing. And of course, there are some ground rules there. It's, small dry flies. I typically am going to fish them on 4X or 5X, something that's relatively thin and supple and will drift nicely in the current. If I'm fishing a big streamer, I might go as heavy as 0X or maybe even like 16-pound fluoro, something like that, where I really don't care so much about the diameter of my tippet going to the fly because the fly itself has so much action.
Yeah, but I mean, you said it. You're not going to fish a size 20 dry fly with 0X. I mean, you're not even going to get it through the eye of the hook, much less be able to lay it out there and present it nicely. So I like what you said about it's more really about the fly and the system as opposed to the species.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're going to pick your fly based on the species and what they want to eat, and then you match that tippet up to what's going to work with presenting that fly.
Yep, exactly.
Well, this brings us to another topic, all right? We've talked a little bit about the size rating, the pound test factor. But then we have to choose the right length for a leader, right? And again, this is confusing. People walk into that fly shop, there's so many options. So you see, you've determined that 5X is what you want to fish, right? You're going to buy a packaged 5X leader. You're probably going to buy a spool of 5X to add to it, maybe 4 and 6, so you can alter the diameter with your system. But then you go over to where 5X is, and you have choices between 7.5 feet and 9 feet. And 12 feet. And it's all still, that 4X or 5X or whatever it is. Talk to us a little bit about all these options that are available when it comes to length.
Sure. So it's a wide range of lengths available, of course. And that all has to do with the fishing situation you're going to be in. There's a couple of ways I think about it. First one, more length of your leader system will obviously put the opaque fly line. It's probably opaque. Maybe you're fishing a clear floating line or something like that. But it puts that thick fly line further from the fish. So it's not as close to the target. If you've got really spooky conditions, clear water, slow water in particular, I like longer leaders in that scenario, just so you're not putting the fly line as close to the target fish. And then the other way I think of it is in terms of turning the fly over. So a longer leader turns over less powerfully. A shorter leader will turn over more powerfully. You can typically turn over a bigger fly and cast a big fly more effectively on a shorter leader.
Well, let me throw out a couple of fishing scenarios, and you tell our listeners what you would personally suggest when it comes to length, all right? Like, again, let's talk about a standard trout fishing scenario, medium-sized Western River. Let's say you're fishing a size 14 dry fly on a summer day, ballpark length.
In that case, a 9-foot leader is probably right where you need to be. That's sort of the middle of the distribution for leader length. It's maybe the most versatile leader length, and that's a pretty typical kind of up-the-gut trout fishing application. 9 foot is right where I would start on that scenario.
All right, so let's say we're fishing a giant salmon fly, right? Big dry pattern. You're in fast-moving riffles. You're kind of pounding the banks. Maybe you're floating in a drift boat. Are you adjusting the length with that larger dry fly?
Absolutely. So that's a good scenario for a shorter leader. You've got a harder fly to cast that's more wind resistant. A shorter leader will help you turn it over more consistently. And it's also less critical to make a delicate presentation. Salmon flies are, they bounce around on the water. They make lots of noise. The fish are usually attracted to that noise. So I'm less concerned with a delicate presentation, more concerned with just being able to get the fly to the target.
And turn it over. Mm-hmm. How about nymph fishing, standard trout flies under an indicator?
That's a tricky one because it all is going to depend on how your nymphs want to sink in the water. So if I'm using a short leader and I'm trying to fish a nymph deep, there's a lot of that tapered leader that's bigger in diameter is going to need to sink to get the fly to the bottom and hopefully where the fish are eating. In that case, it makes sense to lengthen your tippet, add a little bit more level tippet because it'll actually sink faster. It gets dragged down through current more easily, cuts through conflicting currents better. So that's a scenario where I think more about the length of my tippet relative to the tapered section of my leader rather than the entire length of the leader.
All right, how about streamer fishing out of a drift boat? And let's say we're fishing one of like Kelly Gallup's big giant Muppet flies, all right? On 0X or 15 pound even. What length are you typically going with in those streamer scenarios?
I like really short in that case, particularly if I'm fishing a sink tip fly line. So if the fly line itself is supposed to be sinking and dragging the fly under, I don't want a long 15-foot leader that's going to let the fly kind of dangle up higher in the current. I want a shorter leader that's going to get dragged down faster. And also those big flies, they're difficult to cast. It takes a little bit more power to turn them over. So a short leader, like 4 or 5 feet even, that's usually where I land in that application.
All right, how about super technical trout fishing? Let's say we're on the Railroad Ranch down in the Henry's Fork, or we're on one of the Paradise Valley Spring Creeks, and let's say it's like late August, right? These fish are super tricky. What are you going with there?
Well, late August on the ranch, I'm usually doomed anyway, so who knows? But no, in all seriousness, like a 15-foot leader is like a really good starting point in that scenario. Long length, keep the fly farther from the fish, or the fly line farther from the fish, rather. A long tippet in that case also helps you drift the fly more naturally and kind of deal with some of those conflicting currents. So I would say 15 feet is a good starting point there.
All right, well, let's mix it up. Let's talk saltwater. How about permit fishing on the flats of southern Belize? Let's say you're wading. It's pretty skinny water. You're looking for tailing fish.
That's another scenario for a long leader for sure. You're trying to be as stealthy as possible. You're trying to keep the splat and the shadow of the fly line farther from the target fish. That's another one where, maybe you're starting with a 12-foot tapered leader. Maybe you're adding another 3 feet of tippet beyond that just to lay the fly down more gently.
Well, let's switch over to the Bahamas. Let's say you're bone fishing, kind of a standard Bahamian situation. And because it's a standard Bahamian situation, you're dealing with wind. What are you going with there?
That's a good one. So in wind, it's always easier to cast a shorter leader. Bonefish, sometimes you can get away with a nice short leader. You might be able to catch them on a 7.5-foot leader. More typically, I think you want your leader length about 10 feet in that scenario, again, just to keep the line away from the fish. But that's a scenario where we actually at RIO, we're playing with some variables beyond just length and diameter. We're actually changing the length of the tapered section relative to the tippet. So we can produce a 10-foot leader that turns over more powerfully and lets you deal with that wind while still maintaining that length.
Nice. Well, basically, what we can kind of take away from those different scenarios is longer leaders for trickier situations, spooky fish, and shorter leaders when you can get away with it, right? Especially if you're fishing some exotic destination where the fish really aren't leader shy. They don't get a lot of pressure. You can usually cheat it back and oftentimes fish a shorter leader.
Exactly.
But it really depends on the situation. There's so many different scenarios out there. You just got to kind of figure out what your target species is and then factor in things like, the typical distance of a cast required for that species, or wind, or, water clarity. All of these things really help determine the ultimate length of your system that you're fishing.
Yep, that's exactly right. And that's why it pays to maintain some flexibility too. Being able to adjust on the water, having the gear with you need to add tippet or cut back tippet or change tippet size and overall leader length. Really important for a day of fishing.
Yeah, you see an angler out there with the clipped-on spool holder with like 8 different spools of tippet. Well, there's a reason. You got to be able to adapt and adjust.
Yep, you got it.
Okay, so now we have now we have an idea, right, of the pound rating and strength of the material. We've talked a little bit about that. We've talked about length, but still, we got this wall in the fly shop. You got all these options. We have not yet covered all the bases when it comes to these options. Because now, aside with strength, the X system, pound test, the length of the leader, you get to decide on the type of material, all right? You on this wall, you've got options that include monofilament, you've got fluorocarbon, you've got nylon. Let's talk about the material options and explain the differences between these materials. And I know, for example, like fluorocarbon specifically, we could talk for hours about the applications of fluorocarbon, but start with kind of the standard options that people are going to find and tell us the differences.
Sure. Yeah. So in terms of material, it really falls into 2 basic categories. There's nylon and there's fluorocarbon. You'll sometimes hear monofilament and nylon referred to interchangeably. Usually they mean the same thing. To be really precise about it, there's nylon and there's fluorocarbon. Those are kind of the 2 options. Nylon is a little different than fluorocarbon in that it's a little bit less abrasion resistant. In most cases, there are of course exceptions, and there's different processes we can use manufacturing the stuff to increase abrasion resistant. But as a general rule, nylon is less abrasion resistant than fluoro. It's also less dense than fluoro. Neither of them floats. That's another misconception. Some people think nylon floats and fluoro sinks. They actually both sink, but fluorocarbon sinks faster.
Because of that density.
Exactly. Higher density, faster sink rate. Then the last difference that people talk about is refractive index. And refractive index describes how much a material bends light when the light passes through it. And water has a refractive index that bends light as light passes through it. Nylon and fluorocarbon also have refractive indices, but fluorocarbon's is closer to that of water. So what that means is underwater, it looks more like the water around it, and it appears a little bit clearer than nylon.
So a little more invisible, probably an advantage.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people swear by that. There are cases where it doesn't make a big difference in my experience. There's other cases where having fluoro underwater rather than nylon is the difference between getting a bite and not.
But let's say I'm fishing dry flies, right, in slow moving or fairly clear water. Am I leaning more towards nylon because it is, again, they both sink, but fluoro is going to be denser and it's going to sink quicker?
Yeah, I would say that's generally true. Nylon's probably a better choice for dry fly fishing, particularly in bigger tippet sizes. When you get up into like 2x, 1x, 0x, fluorocarbon wants to sink more because of that density. Down at the lowest end, 6x, 7x, I don't see much of a difference in my experience really with how a dry fly floats, whether that's nylon or fluoro.
Got it. What about the saltwater applications? Let's say you're out on the flats, it's crystal clear. Again, you're throwing at spooky permit or bonefish. Have you got a preference between nylon and fluoro in those situations?
Yeah, I really like fluorocarbon for saltwater fishing. That's not to say you can't catch fish on nylon, but I think fluoro is the right choice typically in a flats fishing scenario. It's stealthier because it's a little bit clearer underwater. It's also a little bit more abrasion resistant. Typically on the flats, when you hook a fish, they're trying to run you around a mangrove or, a ridge in the sand or whatever. There's all kinds of ways your leader and tippet can get chewed up. So I prefer fluoro in those scenarios.
Now, are there any environmental aspects or concerns about the use of fluoro versus nylon? The production process is different. The key ingredients are obviously different. Is there one that is kind of a little bit more friendly than the other one, or anything to consider there?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's a pretty hotly debated topic. My opinion on it is that the environmental difference between the two is minimal. Nylon does break down a little faster in the environment, but it still takes, decades and decades. If you leave a nylon leader on the bottom of a river, it's going to be around for a long time to come. Fluorocarbon stays around even longer, but, between the two of them, neither is good to be thrown in the river. You want to keep that stuff out of there at all costs.
Yeah, pack it out. Find a little system where you can, even if it's 6 or 12 inches that you're cutting off, stick that back in your chest pack or vest pocket. Don't be dropping it on the riverbank or into the stream, regardless of the material type, nylon versus fluoro. That stuff is going to stick around a long time.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Well, how about the castability difference between nylon and fluoro? Any kind of specific thoughts you have on that? Does one turn over better? Is one better to use with longer leaders versus shorter leaders? Castability of the materials.
Oh man, that's a good one. Yeah. Yeah, I would say for like diameters, if I have 2 leaders, they both start at the same diameter at the butt end, they end at the same diameter at the tip, and they're the same length. The fluorocarbon leader will actually turn over a little bit more powerfully. I'll be able to throw a bigger fly. I'll be able to, turn over a cast into the wind a little bit better. And that's because the leader weighs more. We talked about density being a difference between those two materials. A fluorocarbon leader made to the same dimensions as a nylon leader will actually be a little bit heavier, and that gives you a little bit more power when you're turning over a cast.
A little more punchability when you're putting it out there.
Exactly.
Well, I think it's so interesting to talk about the castability of these materials because as an industry and as anglers, we're oftentimes obsessed with it, the fly line. It's all about the taper of the fly line, how the fly line turns over. But then you've got that last 9, 10, 12 feet, whatever it is, between the fly line and the actual fly. That is a factor as well. That's going to either help or hurt your overall fly line system. So it's something you definitely have to think about.
Yeah, that's hugely important. And, matching the right leader to a fly line for a fishing situation is, it's as important as having the right fly line to begin with. And you can actually change the way a fly line turns over by altering your leader as well. If you've got a fly line that really punches the fly over hard, but you find yourself in like a technical dry fly scenario, by fishing a longer leader, I can kind of tone back the power that fly line turns a fly over. And conversely, if I've got my, Spring Creek fly line out there and all of a sudden there's like hoppers blowing into the water, I can cut that leader back and now my really technical, delicate dry fly line will turn over a hopper just fine as well.
That makes sense. I think that's something people don't oftentimes think about, but you can radically change how that fly line is going to perform just with that last, 9, 10, 12 feet of material.
Yeah, those details really matter.
Well, these days, most anglers are fishing these integrated tapered leaders. Now, it's this extrusion process. Give us a quick answer on how these leaders are made. What does that extrusion process look like?
Yeah, sure. They're made from a thermoplastic material to begin with. That's just a plastic that you can melt and then form in its molten phase. So they're melted. That's pushed through a die at a set diameter. It's a big diameter to start with. And then it's all about before the material solidifies again and cools, it's how fast that material is drawn. So they're actually pulling the material at various speeds in order to draw diameter down and thin it out at the tippet end while you're keeping it thick at the butt end.
All right, so pretty cool process, but one that a lot of times people are like, oh, how do they taper it? How does this happen? There's machines that do this, and it's about stretching it at certain points and also at certain times before it hardens.
Exactly.
Well, again, everyone's fishing kind of tapered leaders, integrated leaders these days, but not that long ago, there were no tapered leaders, right? People essentially had to build their own using varying sizes of tippet material and kind of stepping down and tapering their leader, using a series of knots and different diameters of tippet. Those were always referred to as kind of your knotted leaders versus knotless or tapered leaders. Some people still like to build their own leaders. I mean, we see that. Are there any advantages or disadvantages to the two options? Is there any reason you would want to fish kind of a hand-built knotted leader these days?
Yeah, sure. I know some people who fish them to great effect still. That's all they ever fish. Typically, it's people who learned how to fly fish before we had a tapered knotless leader. But there are a couple advantages. One is they're infinitely customizable. If you don't like RIO's taper on such and such leader, you can build your own to any spec you feel like. You can make the butt thicker, you can make it thinner, longer, shorter, more steps down, fewer, whatever. There's just a bunch of different ways you can alter that leader. The other thing that's interesting about nylon and fluorocarbon both is we talked about how you stretch them at various speeds to get that tapered leader. In order to optimize the strength to diameter ratio of any of those materials, it's easier to get that optimum ratio with just a level section. So what that means in the end basically is the tippet end of your knotless tapered leader, it's pretty strong, it's highly engineered, it worked great, but it's never quite as strong as a level tippet can be. So we can optimize the strength of a level tippet a little bit better than we can the tippet end of a tapered leader.
Well, what about mixing materials? Let's say I buy a standard nylon leader. It shortens up as I change flies, lose flies. And I say, you know what, I'm going to add new tippet, but I'm going to add fluorocarbon onto the standard nylon. Let's say I'm going to join them together with a blood knot, whatever it may be. Is that something you recommend, or is that a bad idea?
I have no fear of that. I know people who get superstitious about tying nylon to fluoro. They think knots are going to slip. I do that all the time. I think if you're tying a good knot and you're testing it and you're seating it well, there's no problem with that. You do get into trouble if you're trying to join pieces of tippet that aren't the same diameter.
Radically
different enough.
Yeah.
Exactly. If there's a big enough difference in diameter, you got to be a little bit more intentional about what knot you choose, and you got to tie a good one to make sure it holds. But mixing material, no problem.
Yeah, tying like a 5X tippet straight onto 0X is going to be problematic.
Yes, absolutely.
That's where you can essentially step down your hand-built or knotted leader, kind of build it yourself to ensure that those knots are going to hold.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, my rule of thumb is I try not to skip more than 1X size. I can tie 2X to 0X just fine. 3X to 0X, you're getting to be a big enough difference in diameter that you might have a problem.
Well, what about the method for attaching the leader and the leader system directly to your fly line? Now, back in the day, you had to use a nail knot to do this because the fly lines came and it was just cut off at the end, and the packaged leaders, or if you're building your own leader, it was just straight material, and you had to tie that nail knot, your little tool, and people were doing it. It scared a lot of people away because it wasn't an easy knot. Now the majority of fly lines, both fresh and saltwater, they come with an integrated built-in loop. And also now you've got your packaged leaders where almost all of them have that integrated loop on the butt end of the leader, right? So you have this loop-to-loop connection where you can quickly, unfurl a leader that you just bought at the fly shop, take it out of the package, stretch it a little bit, and then connect those two loops together. It's great because it's eliminated the nail knot tool. But talk to us about the strength of this loop-to-loop connection. I know in the beginning, there were a lot of people that were like, I cut those things off. They don't hold. They're not that strong. There was some skepticism back in the day. And that was especially applicable when you were like going out and chasing GTs or tarpon or some kind of big creature that was going to test every aspect of your setup. Have these loop-to-loop connections, have they improved? And are you completely confident in these systems now?
I am. I always trust the loop on a fly line. At RIO, we spent a lot of time kind of altering how those have been welded in the past. We've actually gone through 3 different iterations of welding equipment in our factory. Each one designed a little differently to give you a more consistent loop and be able to weld it a little bit more quickly. I really like the welded loops. The way we test them, in fact, in the factory is we can't test every one to failure. Obviously, you need to send some good product out, but we do test loops to failure periodically throughout a shift. And usually what we find is the fly line actually breaks in the core before the loop opens up. And so that gives me confidence to use a loop-to-loop connection. Of course, there are situations where your loop can get damaged while you're fishing. It pays to pay attention to that, like any knot. You don't want to just grab your rod with a knot you tied 5 seasons ago and hope it holds. But yeah, I have a lot of confidence in those loop-to-loop connections.
So don't fear the loop. That's what you're telling us.
Exactly. And in fact, our GT line, we just recently made another change to a loop. We now weld those things with a protective Kevlar sleeve around the bend in the fly line and the loop. And that's just even more protection from, abrasion on coral heads or whatever your angry GT happens to find out there to wrap you around.
So that's the connection of the fly line to the leader system. How about some common knots used to connect new tippet material to an existing leader? You have any favorites? I mean, we obviously have the blood knot, the surgeon's knot. What are your thoughts on that? And do you change your knot with different diameters of tippet?
Yeah, the blood knot and the surgeon knot are the two common ones, of course. I'm a blood knot guy. I just prefer that one. The reason I like that one is not because it's always stronger or because it's easier to tie, but it's easier for me to tell if I've tied it correctly. So when I seat it, I can see visually, my tag should be going opposite ends. I should have nice tight wraps on either side of it. If it looks good and I give it a little tug, I know everything's, seated well and going to work for me. I've got friends who only fish surgeon's knots too. That works as well. They've just got more confidence in tying that knot. For me, it's just about which one you're most comfortable tying.
Yeah, and I oftentimes find that if I'm, tying 0x to 1x or 0x to 2x, I love that blood knot because, again, you see that barrel to barrel, tightness of those coming together. But if you're going 5x to 6x, let's say, the blood knot can be a little trickier, and oftentimes the surgeon's loop is just quicker.
Yeah.
I think the diameter of the material you're using can definitely make a difference with which knot you're choosing.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people find that surgeon's knot a little bit easier to tie. I agree. When you've got the really small sizes and especially if your fingers are cold, if you're fishing and it's 40 degrees out and you're fumbling around with those small materials, it can be more difficult to get that blood knot to come together.
Well, you touched on something just a moment ago that I want to come back to, and that is how often you should change or replace your tippet and leader material while fishing. Let's say, for instance, you land a big trout, right? And it's in fast water, and it took you some time to get this fish in, and he kind of put you through the ringer. At that point, when you've released that fish, has your tippet material itself weakened or degraded? Or is it more just about kind of wear and tear on the knot? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, we test this pretty thoroughly in the factory. The tippet materials we sell, they're not weakened by putting them in tension. You can tension them, and as long as they don't break, your next fish, it's not going to necessarily be any weaker. It'll perform exactly the same. The place you get in trouble is if the leader or tippet is dragged across some immovable object. You've got all kinds of chatter and abrasion on it. That will absolutely weaken the tippet. So, my strategy when I'm on the water is always just to inspect the leader. I run my finger down the leader or the tippet. If I feel any kind of chatter or any abrasion, that's when I know it's time to change.
How about thin tippet material and wind knots? How does that impact the strength or integrity of that system?
It ruins it completely. That's the worst part of wind knots is it actually, depending on the tippet material, it can weaken it by anywhere from like 30% to 50%. So, if you're fishing 7X and you're trying to catch a big trout that's sipping small midges and you've only got 2.5 pounds of break strength to begin with, if you put a wind knot in that, now you've only got 1.2 or 1.3 pounds of break strength. So that can make or break your day of fishing. I'm always looking for wind knots and trying to remove them.
Well, that's great advice. I mean, anglers have to pay attention to that and not be lazy. Again, if you are in that situation and you notice wind knots, step back, get out your material, retie, and get back in the game. Because, you're working hard to get those big fish and you feel like an idiot when you break it off because of a wind knot.
Absolutely. It's self-defeating to keep fishing a wind knotted leader for sure.
Well, let me ask you, how long will a packaged leader or spool of tippet last? Will the material, even if unused, will this degrade over time? You know, you often hear people talking about, oh man, I just got a fresh spool of tippet or a fresh leader. It's stronger, you know, it hasn't degraded. Is there any truth to this?
It depends on the conditions that the leader or tippet are exposed to. So if it's, you know, at room temperature, out of direct sunlight, in a dry place, it never degrades. It'll stay good functionally forever. Nothing happens to it chemically. It doesn't weaken. It doesn't change color. The way you get in trouble is one, UV exposure. If you leave a pack of tippet or a spool of tippet or a pack of leaders on your dashboard of your truck and then park it in the sun for the whole summer, that stuff will go bad pretty quickly. It's because the UV can damage those materials. Heat isn't very good for tippet and leader material either. If you expose them to high temperatures, that can alter sort of the physical structure of the polymer that makes up that material. And then the last one is exposure to water. So nylon actually absorbs water at a pretty high rate. You can actually measure a difference in the weight of your nylon material after you've soaked it in water for a while. So soaking up water will weaken that material. Fluorocarbon is usually less susceptible to damage from water, but those are some of the ways that tippet can go bad.
So it matters how you store it, where you keep it. If you are doing a lot of deep wading and your chest pack tends to fill up with water on a regular basis and you've got spools of nylon tippet in there, that's something to consider as well. And those are all scenarios where you probably want to replace it from time to time.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, we think about the importance of these two key items to fishermen, right? Your leader and your tippet. You have this super expensive rod that you've invested all this money in. You've got an equally expensive reel. You've got a fly line that maybe you paid $100, $150 for, right? You've got all of your techie gear and your entire kit. And yet the components, the key components that are directly connecting you to the fish once you've finally hooked up are the leader and tippet system. I mean, arguably, and likely the least expensive items in the entire equation. Yet your success at fighting and landing these fish that you've been chasing largely depend on these very basic and inexpensive items, and oftentimes so overlooked by the angler.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And I learned that the hard way. When I started fly fishing, I was trying to save money at all costs and was using, you know, instead of fly fishing specific tippet or a highly engineered product as tippet, I was taking like a spool of Stren from like the wall at Walmart or whatever. And, you know, I can't count how many fish I lost probably because I was fishing a sort of an inferior product and didn't have that full picture of how the leader and tippet play into casting and fish fighting and all that. So take my word for it. You should just fish fresh and high quality leader and tippet.
That's right. And know your knots, you know, because that's usually where things, you know, fail is a bad knot, but having the right material and that high quality material is everything, because again, that is your final connection to the fish. Now, regardless of how much you've spent on all the rest of the gear, that, you know, fairly inexpensive item is the connecting point that's tying you into this animal.
Yep.
So, well, obviously, Chris, the subject of leaders and tippets is a big one. There is so much more we could have talked about in detail, but I think we definitely covered the basics and hopefully clarified a few things for our listeners. I know people have been asking for this episode for a long time, so thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom and your experience with us. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Is there any additional resources? Are there any additional resources or websites or materials where anglers can really go deeper in this and learn more about leader and tippet material, construction techniques, that kind of thing?
Sure. So RIO's website, farbank.com, there's a RIO section that lists all of our leader and tippet materials. It lists lengths, diameters, break strengths for every product we make that way. And I had an opportunity to make a really cool video, a how-to video for RIO a few years ago, where I talk all about how to tune your leader on the water. Like if you find yourself on the water with only a 9-foot leader and you need to, you know, build it out for a longer and lighter presentation or cut it back for a more aggressive presentation with a big fly. We made a video where we covered all the steps of that process in detail. That's available on RIO's YouTube channel.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thanks so much. We appreciate you sitting down with us today. I know our listeners appreciate it. Thanks for joining us on Waypoints.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. It's been great.
Well, that is it for this latest episode. Waypoints is the podcast that is 100% dedicated to travel, destination angling, and the search for adventure. Be sure to visit yellowdogflyfishing.com to plan and research travel, source gear, equipment, and flies for your next destination, and stay up to date on the latest angling news and developments. Join us for our next episode, and always remember that life is short and no one ever regretted a life of adventure.
This has been another episode of Waypoints, the podcast of fly fishing travel and adventure angling. Waypoints is produced by Brian Gregson, with music provided by the Steep Canyon Rangers. Visit yellowdogflyfishing.com for more destination profiles, travel news, and expert advice, and be sure to join us for our next episode.